6 people killed, a dozen still in hospital, and the offender who was gunned down now named. Police have just reiterated they don't believe yesterday's shocking knife attack in a Sydney shopping centre was an act of terrorism. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Horrific, indiscriminate and heartbreaking. That was the Prime Minister's description last night after a man walked into Westfield Bondi Junction and started randomly stabbing shoppers. 5 women and a man died. 12 others remain in hospital this morning, including a 9-month-old baby who's undergone surgery and is in a serious but stable condition. The baby's mother sadly died in hospital. The offender, identified this morning as 40-year-old Queenslander Joel Couchy, was only stopped when confronted by a female police officer who's been hailed as a hero. Police said the offender had mental health issues. Last night, the Prime Minister stood alongside the Federal Police Commissioner to offer the condolences of the nation and pay tribute to those who bravely responded and insist it was too early to speculate on a motive. New South Wales police now say they do not believe this was an act of terrorism.
Tonight, news we hope we'd never have to deliver in this country. A mass killing at Sydney's biggest shopping centre.
Terrified shoppers run for their lives from a man wielding a knife. Stabbing people, including children.
I've seen a baby with stab wounds.
A baby?
Yeah, there's a baby getting wheeled off by the ambulance.
I was hiding in the back room and I was just hearing gunshots. It's just like the worst thing ever.
As a result, there were 4 female women deceased in the shopping centre and 1 male, and subsequently another female passed away in hospital, taking it to a total of 6.
The devastating scenes at Bondi Junction are beyond words or understanding. Australians will be shocked this evening.
From preliminary inquiries, it would appear that this person has acted alone.
If in fact it is the person that we believe it is, then we don't have fears for that person holding an ideation. In other words, that it's not a terrorism incident.
He was just walking like he was having an ice cream in the park, you know, and then he went up the escalators at Zara. And then probably within about a minute, we heard 3 gunshots, and that was it.
A single unit officer, inspector of police, was nearby, attended.
He was just about ready to go on another more rampage, and she told him to put it down, and then she shot him.
The police officer that attended was enormously courageous.
She took the actions that she did, saving a range of people's lives.
That's confirmation of who we are. Brave, strong, together.
My guest this morning is Treasurer Jim Chalmers. First, let's check what's making news. And the Bondi Junction attack dominates the media here and is making headlines internationally as well. Eyewitness accounts detail how it unfolded, with praise for one brave man who confronted the attacker with a shopping centre bollard at the top of an escalator. As for the police officer who eventually took the offender down, she entered the building alone and was directed by shoppers to the 5th floor. She found the attacker and told him to put the knife down. When he refused and moved towards her, she shot him before applying CPR. The man, 40-year-old Joel Couchy, died at the scene. In other news, the Israeli military says Iran has launched a number of drones and cruise missiles towards Israel. Iran has also seized a commercial ship with links to Israel as it passed through the Strait of Hormuz. The US has been warning for days of an imminent attack in retaliation for a strike on Iran's embassy in Syria, which killed senior members of its Revolutionary Guard. For more on this, let's go live to our Middle East correspondent, Alison Horn, who's in Jerusalem. Alison, tell us, what is the latest there?
Good morning, David. Over the last 15 minutes, we've seen the result of the first wave of those drones and missiles coming here to Jerusalem and further over Israeli airspace. I've personally been seeing dozens of drones that have been intercepted in the sky above my place here in Jerusalem. We've seen hundreds of rocket alerts that have been sent out across Israel, particularly in areas around central Israel, which seems to indicate that some of those drones and missiles may be more targeted towards military facilities. What we don't know is whether or not there will be another wave of rockets and missiles. Israel itself says that all of its aerial defence capabilities are ready, and we have seen a result of that so far already. The Iron Dome has been shooting down a number of these drones and rockets. We don't know at this stage yet whether or not any of them have made landfall within Israeli airspace. We understand the United States and the UK are also assisting in shooting down some of these drones and missiles coming into Israel at this stage.
So, Alison, those aerial defences, Iron Dome, the first line of defence for these missiles and drones, but what other precautions is Israel taking on the ground there?
Well, everybody has been put on high alert already tonight. We once ourselves have had to go into our bomb shelter as well. It's just gone past 2 a.m. here local time, so not many people in Israel would be sleeping tonight. For the next 2 days at a minimum, all schooling, that includes universities, childcare, any sort of educational activities have been banned. Gatherings have been limited to 1,000 people outside. We know that Israel's security cabinet has been meeting throughout the evening, and they'll continue to meet. The questions remain now whether or not there will be any further response from Israel, which could see this escalate into a bigger, wider regional conflict.
Alison Horn, stay safe. Really appreciate you joining us with that live update. Thank you. Well, we had planned to start this morning with the Prime Minister's big plans to subsidise local manufacturing, and we will come to that with the Treasurer shortly. But there's a lot going on, as we saw there. We're going to begin with what unfolded yesterday afternoon at Bondi Junction in Sydney. I mean, visiting a shopping centre on a Saturday is such a familiar thing for us to do. This sort of horrific attack has understandably shocked many. And given the heightened community tensions at the moment, there were fears over what might have motivated such an attack. As we heard, though, the New South Wales Police Commissioner last night was confident enough to say she did not believe this was an act of terrorism. That's been reiterated just in the last half hour by police as well. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by David Crowe, Anna Henderson and John Kehoe. Good to have you all here. David, just starting with what's happening, and we're still getting more information from police. They've just a short time ago named the offender here. What more do we know about him?
We know that he's a person from Queensland who moved to Sydney in the last month. Was known to police in Queensland for offences that do not sound like they were significant offences, or we don't know exactly what they were. He had a storage facility in Sydney, a very small one. All the indications are, I think, from that perhaps he was a homeless person in Sydney, and clearly they're talking about mental health issues. And I think now there is a bit more clarity about the situation here. But yesterday afternoon, already on social media, there was speculation about terrorism, and I think the federal authorities were quite quick, quite effective, I think, at working through what was known here so that we did get clarity during the afternoon. And I think, credit to all those in the shopping centre who dealt with this, including those in uniform and civilians as well. Incredible, horrific scenes. But at a time of really heightened concerns about social cohesion, I think it was natural for the Prime Minister and others to then get briefings from the AFP, Commissioner Reece Kershaw, and the ASIO boss, Mike Burgess, because there was this issue of, well, is there a security threat? Is there a risk of any other attacks? And thank goodness they got clarity on that as the afternoon went on.
Well, I'll just show you, just half an hour or so ago, we heard this latest update from New South Wales Police about the offender.
I can tell you that a 40-year-old man from Queensland, Joel Couchy, has been identified as the offender in this matter. We are continuing to work through the profiling of the offender, but very clearly to us at this stage it would appear that this is related to the mental health of the individual.
And worth noting, as David says, there might have been a lot of social media speculation about the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, other senior political figures were all pretty careful, pretty cautious about jumping to any conclusions last night.
Absolutely, and then keen to kind of put out as much as they could to dampen any idea that this was particularly ideologically motivated terrorism. And the reason for that is because when you look at, say, the ASIO terrorism threat assessment at the moment, which is still possible, they talk about the type of attack. It would be a lone wolf. They would go to a public place, a supermarket, shopping centre type environment is named, and use a rudimentary weapon like a knife or a gun that they could get their hands on. So you can understand why, you know, when you look at that broader context of what ASIO considers to be the threat, this had some potential markers, and the offender was wearing green and gold colours. You know, it's understandable that there was concern. And I think from the political side and from the police side, given there is so much heightened tension in the community, the concept of anything being misconstrued, retaliations in Australia, so dangerous. They needed to get the message out as soon as possible.
No, I agree. Very important to do that. Just still shocking nonetheless, John. We're just not used to this sort of thing in Australia. I think this is the worst mass killing in New South Wales in more than a decade. You see mass shootings in the United States more regularly, but this sort of thing in Australia, fortunately, we don't see too often.
Yes, having lived in America for 5 years, one of the early reactions in our household last night, David, was this is the sort of thing we're used to seeing in America, often with dozens more victims with guns over there. And as tragic...
Thank God for our gun laws.
Yeah, as tragic as it is, thank God we have tighter gun laws, because there could have been dozens more victims. Yeah.
Look, let's move on, and we will come to what's happening in Israel as well a little later. But I want to turn to the big politics, the big political event of the week, the Prime Minister's pre-budget, pre-election speech, if you will, where he's laid out his plans for a future made in Australia. This will involve more government subsidies and incentives to build things like solar panels and batteries and other green technology in Australia. We'll come to how far they're willing to go and what the risks might be, but here's a little of Anthony Albanese laying out the case as to why we need more government intervention to build this stuff in Australia.
We need as well to look at our national sovereignty and where we need to ensure that we can stand on our own 2 feet. We can't be vulnerable. That is one of the lessons of the global pandemic, is that we do need a more resilient economy that's about a future made here.
John, I think everyone loves to see stuff made in Australia. The question is, at what price? Do we know yet?
Well, the details are yet to emerge, aren't they? And this is one of the, I guess, the risks with what the government's put out there so far. We don't actually know the details, but we know there's going to be more subsidies, incentives, perhaps streamlining for things like batteries, solar panels, green hydrogen, maybe about a bunch of other things in green manufacturing as well. But I think it's important we see the detail, because at the moment, there is a lot of warnings out there from policy economists saying, from former productivity commissioners and the current one as well, that this is a very slippery slope to be betting taxpayer money on this and a whole lot of other issues as well.
We do know, I guess, some of the detail because there are existing schemes already out there. This is also about rolling in those existing solar panel, hydrogen, critical mineral schemes that are in place, putting them under one umbrella. Now, there will be more in the budget. My understanding is it won't necessarily be on the scale of things that are already out there. But Anna, the Prime Minister, what's he trying to do here? Let us all know 12 months out from the election, this is what he wants to fight on.
Deal with the opposition's concerns in campaign around the net zero transition being an economic drag and what's going to happen to your jobs. He's made this announcement. He's focused in Queensland. He wants to send out a message there as well that there will be jobs for you in the future. One thing that I think around that kind of jobs argument and, you know, the made in Australia, like we're hearing it across the world, you know, we've got the made in China 2024 policy. The US is leaning into this idea that you manufacture here, we make things in our own country. But on the one hand, you have the Prime Minister saying this is about creating jobs as well into the future. But then when we ask about cost, he says, oh, it's going to be so much more automated. You know, we're not going to need to rely on the cost of labour. So I think there is a question mark there that I'm left with around, you know, how he's going to sell this.
Well, I guess there'd be some jobs.
Of course.
And it's better to have them here than somewhere else, but not the sort of manufacturing of, you know, car making days, you know, decades ago. And look, he's right, David, to point out other countries heading down this path. He says, you know, you've got this global shift underway. The big one's the US Inflation Reduction Act. Is that working?
Yes, it is working because it's drawing huge amounts of investment into American industry at a cost. one of the estimates from the investment banks is that the cost over a decade in fiscal support will be $1 trillion. That's US dollars.
Yeah.
So that's one estimate. So we're talking about massive programs.
And we can't do that.
We can't match it, and the Prime Minister says we're not going to match it dollar for dollar.
Nor do we necessarily have the economy of the United States to be able to.
We're smaller. They're going to be more targeted, but we don't know the full price for the federal scheme at the moment. Now, I think we've got, in some ways, a pretty lacklustre economic debate in Australia. There hasn't been a big growth agenda debate for some time. So the plus side of this argument for Made in Australia is at least we're getting a growth debate. However, the terms and conditions are the thing. We don't know when taxpayers would get their money back. And even though other countries are doing the same thing, the US, Canada, the EU, they're all in a kind of race to the bottom with subsidies. And so there's a great risk that we're all competing against each other. But when you look at the geopolitics, all these democracies are putting up new subsidies, basically all worried about China, which of course subsidises its manufacturing as well. So it's subsidies v subsidies.
Yeah, John?
But let's be serious, we're not going to be competitive in making batteries, solar panels. We've got a whole lot of things working against us. A high cost economy, higher labour costs, a small population spread over a big area. We don't have the economies of scale of America or China. If they want to go ahead and subsidise their industries, great, let them, because that can drive the cost down for these technologies around the world. And then we can adopt that and bring that into our technology.
What's wrong with buying, quality, cheap solar panels from the United States?
99% of the solar panels come from overseas, and a large proportion come from China. And this is why the geopolitics and the security concerns tend to distort the whole economic argument, because you would argue John's point on the economics, and the defence is, yeah, but we can't be that dependent on China. And so it becomes a strategic question.
Is that a fair argument?
I think it's fair, but I mean, we don't know the scale of the subsidies to justify that.
It's the thin end of the wedge though, isn't it? Because you've got to apply that blanket rule to dozens or hundreds of products. Why are solar panels special? It's just carte blanche for ministers to say, we're going to throw money after this, this and this. And $1 billion on solar panels, it's quite a bit of money when solar panel companies around the world are going bankrupt because the price of them has collapsed. We're better off friend-shoring things from allies such as South Korea, Japan, the United States, and benefiting from their more economies of scale.
There is pressure though. There's pressure from places like the EU for Australia to take a leading role and to push countries like Japan and South Korea to go harder in their transition. The government does need to build a message that it wants to speed up the transition. Here's how we do it. We try and ameliorate, in their view, the coalition's argument by selling more of a conceptual message to the community about how we're going to ensure that you still have a job.
And look, clearly it's got to be targeted, right? You've got to choose what you're going to back. I spoke for the Insiders on Background podcast this week to Bran Black, the head of the Business Council of Australia, and he makes the point that you obviously can't spread these subsidies around everywhere. You've really got to pick and choose. Have a look.
I would be encouraging a full review of where Australia is investing its funds. And I think there are a couple of key principles that you'd want to bear in mind there. The first is don't invest in something that's never going to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, that's never going to be sustainable in and of its own right. I think the second is, and at the opposite end of the spectrum, don't invest in anything that can, on its own, entirely support itself. We shouldn't be putting taxpayer funds towards those types of initiatives.
And if you want to watch that full conversation with Bran Black from the Business Council, you can do so. You can listen to it on the ABC Listen app, watch it on iView, the QR codes are there. I guess the most concerning criticism or concern raised, for the government at least, was from Danielle Wood, the current chair of the Productivity Commission, as you mentioned, John. What's her issue?
Well, there's a couple of things, and good on her for stepping forward because she sort of put herself out there, a Labor appointee as well. And I think perhaps Treasury and the Finance Department haven't had as much success pushing back on some of this at the Expenditure Review Committee, so it's been up to the Independent Productivity Commission to step forward and draw a bit of a line in the sand. Look, there's a couple of things. One, there's obviously taxpayer money being at risk, but that's perhaps not the biggest issue. The bigger issue, I think, is that we're potentially going to divert finite limited resources in an economy, that's labour, capital, machinery, equipment, to other more inefficient sectors aren't going to be as high a return. That's not necessarily good for productivity, living standards, real wages. And particularly, and this is the key point, in a fully stretched economy where unemployment's very low, you've got high inflation, the cost of that is even bigger diverting those resources. And in the medium term, it can mean more inflation pressures. Now, I'm sure the government's going to stagger this and stage it, so I'm not suggesting it's going to lead to an initial immediate inflation pulse. But the danger is that we put this sort of system through the economy and we're diverting resources away from more productive areas. At the same time, we're trying to do the energy transition, build 1.2 million homes, build infrastructure, do the whole green manufacturing thing. We can't do it all at once.
Well, we'll see. Let's hear more from the Treasurer about all of this. Time to talk to Jim Chalmers, and as discussed, we'll find out more about all this in next month's budget, about just how far the government is planning to go with further subsidies for green technology. As an example of what Labor's trying to do here, the Prime Minister did point to recent funding given to a solar panel company to help it stay in Australia rather than shift to the United States.
If there weren't opportunities for SunDrive to stay in Australia, then they too would have gone offshore. We need to acknowledge that this is a reality, that we are in a global competition for capital, a global competition where there are incentives for companies to be based in the United States, in different economies as well.
Treasurer, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, David.
Now, we'll come to your plans on manufacturing in a moment, but I do want to start with the horrific attack at Bondi Junction. What's your reaction to what's happened there?
Well, it's devastating and senseless and really quite hard to fathom. I think everybody's heart breaks for the loved ones of the victims, but also the workers and the witnesses who will remember that day for the rest of their lives. And we pay tribute to the police officer, all the first responders, indeed everybody who put themselves in harm's way to try and limit the senseless carnage that we saw at Bondi Junction.
And just the other breaking, unfolding news that's happening in the Middle East right now with Iran launching attacks on Israel, missiles and drones. How worried are you about that?
Oh, these are incredibly concerning developments. We've seen enough bloodshed in the Middle East already. We don't want to see more innocent lives lost in that part of the world. And it would be much better if the Iranians used their influence in the region to try and calm tensions rather than inflame them.
Does Australia stand with Israel at the moment?
Oh, we've made it clear through other spokespeople already out today that we condemn the actions of the Iranians. As I said, Iran can have a positive role to play in the region or a negative role to play in the region. This will inflame tensions further. Our big concern here is that we don't want conflict in the Middle East to be broader and deeper than it already is. We've already seen enough lives lost. And so that's why these developments yesterday and overnight are incredibly concerning to all of us.
I will come back to the potential budget and economic impact of what's going on in the Middle East too. Look, let's turn though to the plan, a future made in Australia, more subsidised local manufacturing. Just to pick up on what we heard from the Prime Minister just there, why should Australian taxpayers be giving money to a private company to stop it going to the United States? What's the public interest objective here?
Well, a couple of things about that. And our plan for a future made in Australia is much broader and much deeper than the way that you've just described it. The world is changing and that pace of change is accelerating, and we want a slice of the action for our workers and our businesses and our investors. And the opportunity for us lies at the intersection of our industries, our energy, our resource base, our skills and human capital and our investment strategy. And this is how we align our national and economic security interests. It's how we deliver another generation of prosperity by making ourselves an indispensable part of the global push to net zero. And so when it comes to public and private investment, it's really important to remember that what we're talking about here isn't some kind of free-for-all of public funds. You know, we're talking about incentivising private investment rather than replacing it. The heavy lifting will still be overwhelmingly done by the private sector, but there's an important role to play by governments and by public investment as well. That will still only be a sliver of the hundreds of billions of dollars that we need to land this energy transformation, to make ourselves a renewable energy superpower and to secure our place in a future which will be dominated by the net zero economy.
Can you give us a sense of the scale here? I think you used the word targeted there. How far are you willing to go? How much are you willing to spend? Is there any upper limit on this?
Well, we'll obviously make our plans clear on budget night, and I think the Prime Minister has done a terrific job during the week signalling to the Australian people and to our industrial base the sorts of directions that we want to take the country in. In a world of churn and change, we've got big advantages and we want to make the most of those advantages. And so there will be a significant investment in the budget. It will be substantial, but it still won't be the biggest piece of the story here. And that's why the budget will also have a very big focus on how we attract and deploy and absorb private sector investment as well in the service of these really important national economic objectives.
How do you do that? Is that through tax breaks?
That's obviously one of the tools that we are considering, but not the only one. What you'll see on budget night is a broad and comprehensive strategy of which incentives for industry is a part, but not the only part. We really want to incentivise private sector investment as well. We want to turbocharge investment in the future of our economy, and that will be a big focus of the budget.
Because comparatively, Australia has high company tax rates. It's a disincentive, I suppose, to stay or set up in Australia. So you'll try and address that through some form of tax incentive?
Oh, we are prepared to consider the tax system as one of a whole range of levers that may be useful as we pursue a future made in Australia and make ourselves that indispensable part of the global net zero economy. But again, what I'm signalling to your viewers is what they will see on budget night will be broad, it will be comprehensive. The tax system may play a part, public investment will play a part, but overwhelmingly what we're trying to do here is incentivise private investment, not replace it.
Right.
And that will be a big focus too.
If you want to be broad, as you say, you could lower the company tax rate, couldn't you?
Oh, that's not something that people can expect to see when we unveil the full package, but we've said publicly before and certainly behind the scenes we're contemplating whether or not there are ways to use the tax system to incentivise the kind of private investment that we need to see in the future of our economy to ultimately benefit our workers and businesses and investors.
So listening to you, it sounds like the emphasis will be more on tax incentives than direct handouts.
I think people can expect to see some combination of all of the levers available to government. We have a willingness and enthusiasm really to come up with something which is robust and rigorous with strict tests governed by the Act that the Prime Minister flagged during the week. What we're looking for here is where we have genuine advantages and compelling imperatives. We're looking for where we can make our businesses more competitive, build the capacity of our people and our regions, become part of that net zero global economy, turbocharge the private sector, get value for money. These are the sorts of rigorous and robust tests that we will apply to all of these sorts of decisions that you're asking about me about today.
And when you say broad here, can you give us any sense of, I think you also said it would be robust as well and targeted. You've got manufacturers all lining up this week saying, yes, please, we'll take whatever you're offering. Are you only talking about, though, specific green technologies, or would this go to manufacturers of other things that simply want to decarbonise their production line?
Well, I mean broad as in comprehensive, but obviously when it comes to an economy of our size, we need to focus on where we have those genuine advantages and those compelling imperatives. And we have big advantages, whether they are geographical, geological, meteorological, geopolitical. These are our big advantages, and we want to apply that to our thinking about the future of our economy. A future made in Australia really is our big opportunity to deliver the kind of economy that will deliver another generation of prosperity. We need to understand that a generational change in the global economy and in the opportunities available to Australia requires us to undertake a generational change in our thinking, and that's what this will be, and you'll see it on budget night.
Danielle Wood, who you appointed as chair of the Productivity Commissions, raised some concerns about this sort of approach, diverting jobs and investment away from other more productive areas of the economy, the need for an exit strategy so you don't end up subsidising companies forever. Have you spoken to her about these plans?
Oh, we've had general conversations over the course of recent weeks about our aspirations and our objectives here when it comes to being a renewable energy superpower and a future made in Australia. I thought Danielle Wood made some important points, but some obvious points, you know, about making sure we get value for money. We've got strict frameworks, we've got exit strategies and off-ramps, and we're taking into consideration the impact of these plans on the economy more broadly. I think those are important points, but they're also obvious points. They're also factors that we are already taking into consideration as we finalise the policy. Frankly, it would be pretty strange if we weren't.
So she's not out of touch with international reality, as your old boss Wayne Swan suggested?
Well, I respect both of them and I listen to both of them, but I form my own views and I use my own words. And just like Danielle Wood's contribution was important and obvious, I think Wayne's was too. We need to understand that the world is changing, that pace is quickening, and we need a slice of the action. And so I think it's possible to have both of those sets of views simultaneously. We have certainly been factoring in all of those considerations as we finalise the package, and as I said a moment ago, it would be pretty strange if we weren't already thinking along the lines identified by both of them.
As you try to attract more investment, there's also the question of who should be allowed to invest in, I guess, solar panels, battery making, but critical minerals in particular in Australia. You've been working on changes to the foreign investment rules. When can we expect to see them?
We want to streamline and strengthen the foreign investment regime in this country because we want to attract the right kind of investment in our national advantages. And part of making sure that we get the investment climate right is making sure that we strengthen and streamline the Foreign Investment Review Board processes. I have been working on this for some months. I've got a little bit more work to do with my colleagues to finalise a package. I'd like to announce it before budget if I can. That's to be determined, but ideally we'll put the finishing touches on that package and make it public in the coming weeks. And that will be all about recognising that we can streamline investment when it's in areas which are low risk but high reward, and we need to strengthen the arrangements where the risks outweigh the benefits. And so those are my priorities when it comes to foreign investment.
So just to pick up on that,
I have almost finalised that package and I hope to publicise it before long.
So just to pick up on your point there, do you want to make it harder for foreign investment in critical minerals?
I don't think about it necessarily in the broad as about one industry or another. Obviously, there will be elements of that in the final package. But really what we're trying to say here is that overwhelmingly investment in our economy is a good thing. We want to streamline it for investment that is in our national economic and security interests. But we want to strengthen it. We want to make it more robust when that investment is riskier. We don't necessarily just take a sectoral view about that. We apply a whole range of tests. And when I announce our foreign investment reforms in the coming weeks, I'll make it clear how we intend to strengthen it in some areas and streamline it in others.
A lot's been written lately about your appetite for reform, Treasurer. Will this one on the foreign investment rules, should we be seeing this, expecting this to be a significant reform?
Oh, this will be a big economic reform and a bit like the mergers reform that I announced at the Bannerman lecture in Sydney during the week, the biggest change to mergers in half a century, combined with our reforms to foreign investment. You know, these are two important parts of our economic reform agenda, but not the only parts. Any objective observer of our record knows that we are engaged enthusiastically and comprehensively in economic reform, whether it's energy or markets or capital flows, whether it's our institutions. Across a broad range of areas, we are enthusiastic economic reformers. There will always be people who want us to do more. There will always be people who want us to do less. Sometimes their views are informed, sometimes they aren't. But we've done more economic reform in the last 23 months than we've seen in this country for the last 23 years.
Look, let me turn to what's happening in the economy and perhaps internationally first. I think you're off to the United States in a few days for some pre-budget meetings there. Look, inflation has gone up again in the United States. How concerned are you about that, and how does the inflation outlook look to you right here now?
It's true, I'll be meeting with my G20 economic ministerial counterparts and the central bank governors, the IMF, the World Bank and others in Washington DC later this week. That will be an important opportunity to take the temperature of the global economy. Inflation in the US is going up. We've got recessions in some countries. We've got a substantial slowing in the Chinese economy. We've got all of the costs and consequences of these conflicts that we're seeing in two important parts of the world as well. And so all of this will be a factor on the budget and on our economy. It means that the degree of difficulty for this budget is a bit higher, even perhaps than the first two. And the big influences on our budget will be this global economic uncertainty, cost of living pressures, which I'll come back to in a moment, and also the fact that our economy has been slowing as well. We've seen inflation come down in Australia in welcome and encouraging ways. We're seeing it go up in the US, and that reminds us that even though inflation has come off substantially from those peaks a couple of years ago, it's not always in a straight line. It can zig and zag, and that's why a primary consideration in the budget will be continuing the fight against inflation as we deal with slowing growth, as we try and make ourselves more resilient to this global economic uncertainty.
So you don't want to do anything in the budget that's obviously going to make the inflation problem worse. Are you saying it might not keep coming down anytime soon, inflation?
Oh, we still expect inflation to moderate a bit more. It has come off really quite substantially since before the election and since the peaks in 2022. And that's a good thing. But what we're seeing in other countries like the US is that moderation in inflation hasn't been linear. It hasn't been in a straight line. It can zig and zag. And that's why there will be ongoing vigilance in the budget when it comes to the fight against inflation, even as we recognise that the balance of risks are shifting a bit in our economy, global and domestic, and we can't ignore that either.
China, you mentioned China's growth is slowing. What's that mean for us?
We'll get some more numbers from the Chinese economy on Tuesday, but what I can tell you, David, is that our current Treasury forecasts, which will be published in the budget, have a downgrade for Chinese economic growth. What we're looking at here in the current forecast, which will be finalised between now and the budget itself, is growth with a 4 in front of it for 3 consecutive years in China. If that happens, that will be the slowest period of economic growth in China since they started opening up in the late 1970s. So we expect the Chinese economy to be a bit weaker for a bit longer, and that has obvious consequences for us, for our economy, but also for our budget.
What's it mean for the iron ore price?
We've seen the iron ore price come off really quite substantially. This is a big influence on our budget, as you know, not the only influence. The labour market's important here as well. But the iron ore price was more than $130 a tonne at the start of the year. It's been bouncing around in the low 90s. To give you a sense of what that means for the budget, the difference between 130 plus and in the low 90s is something like $9 billion in revenue in the budget, something like $35 billion in nominal economic activity. And so you can see the drop-off in the iron ore price. You can see why this is one of the reasons why we expect much, much smaller revenue upgrades in the budget than we've become accustomed to on the last couple of occasions. That demands a bit of a different approach to the budget, and that's what you'll see on the 14th of May.
So just finally, given that $9 billion hit you just mentioned then, I suspect I know the answer to this, but are you going to get a surplus in this budget?
Oh, that's still our goal. It's a bit harder now because of the iron ore price and because of what we expect to see with the softening in the labour market, but that's still our goal. And that's because the first surplus that we delivered in 15 years last year was an important way to put downward pressure on inflation in our economy. We'd like to have a second one if we can. We're not there yet. The degree of difficulty has gone up a bit, but it's an important way to put downward pressure on inflation. It's not an end in itself. It's how we do engage in the fight against inflation and make our budget stronger in the context of this global economic uncertainty and fund our priorities.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks very much, David.
Well, coming up, we'll turn to those unfolding events in the Middle East. They're clearly contributing to the volatility in this global economic outlook as well. First, let's get back to this conversation with our panel, David Crowe, Anna Henderson and John Kehoe. Well, we heard, let's just rewind to the discussion on manufacturing there. David, I think it's pretty clear the Treasurer is trying to limit some of the debate around this and say it will be targeted, it will be tax incentives. We want to incentivise private spending with the public balance sheet to a degree. What did you make of that?
Well, the question last week was, we're getting a Future Made in Australia Act being put to Parliament to be voted on around May, June. What does the Act do? And it's now
well, the Act wedges the opposition, doesn't it? You've either got to vote for or against all these.
You've either got to vote for Australia or vote against it. I mean, that's the wording of the Act. But we're getting clarity now from the Treasurer on what it will do, and I think that's tax incentives, tax breaks. Now, he said several things in this interview: $9 billion hit to the budget, still aiming for a surplus, changes to foreign investment rules. But it's the tax breaks that are going to be the line item in the budget that could cost money. But I think that cost would grow over time, so it wouldn't wipe out a surplus this year.
And it wouldn't necessarily be inflationary right now, I suppose?
Because it would take time to scale in, and it would depend on how it's targeted. But on your question about company tax, they don't want to lower tax across the board because they don't want any company in any old industry getting an advantage. They want to direct it to these new industries. We don't know how big those tax breaks will be, but that's the clear message from the Treasurer.
And we'll see in, 4 weeks or so when we see the budget. But yeah, it sounds like tax incentives targeted at particular industries. Is that your assessment?
And we're going to have to wait a few more weeks to get that detail, but I was really interested in the foreign investment part of that as well, because that is going to be a huge piece of work.
Strengthening and streamlining.
We need more. We need more.
I think they're actually going to do some positive stuff on foreign investment. I think they are going to actually legitimately make it easier for friendly countries in jurisdictions like Canada, such as the pension funds there, to invest. They've got a lot of capital to deploy in Australia. Sure, they might strengthen it in certain areas. Obviously, there's always concern about Chinese state-owned enterprise. But I think actually removing some of the red tape and regulation to get investment into these sectors, that's a good, costless way for the government actually to be helping facilitate investment.
Well, in simple terms, it's about saying a Canadian pension fund, once you've gone through the process for buying this, it's going to be a lot easier to go through the process for investing in that.
Exactly. You're not going to have to wait another 6 months for the Foreign Investment Review Board to review it again when they've just done you one, approved you on another deal. Now, it can change from asset to asset, obviously critical infrastructure and stuff, but I think overall that should be a good positive thing. It might also be broadened over time to potentially things like environmental approvals for green energy projects and things like that as well.
Yeah, and look, we'll see those foreign investment changes presumably the next 2 or 3 weeks before the budget. What the Treasurer said there about the budget and the global outlook I thought was interesting too. I mean, I think he even said this is in some ways more complicated than you kind of hear this every budget, but does he have a point when you've got inflation now ticking back up in the United States, you've got China slowing in terms of its growth? It is a patchwork.
It's a tricky situation.
In the Middle East.
Yeah, the Middle East. I mean, that could blow oil prices up and be inflationary around the world, disrupt supply chains as well. Let's wait and see what happens there. But I think the US gave us a really good reminder last week with their hotter than expected inflation figure. It's proving to be sticky there, particularly in the same services sector as Australia, things like rent, insurance, personal care services. And it does show the so-called last mile of the inflation fight is going to be difficult. Now, financial markets in Australia have pushed out until February 2025 when they expect the first interest rate cut by the Reserve Bank. Now that's running in to the election campaign territory, so that's very interesting.
They want a rate cut before the election.
And Jim Chalmers' wording there about inflation clearly is holding out the hope that inflation will moderate on a timetable that is faster than the financial markets are assuming, because I tell you what, if the interest rates don't fall until early next year, just a month or two out from an election, how can the government the government can't say to Australians, be grateful for one interest rate cuts. Problem over. They need a few more than that to be secure.
Which again underscores why they can't do anything inflationary right now in this budget. There's already the tax cuts coming. They don't want to go too much beyond that. Look, talking of the Middle East, let's get to the other big issue politically here during the week, and that was this shift in language from the Foreign Minister when it comes to recognition of a Palestinian state. For decades, the bipartisan position has been support for a two-state solution, but only after a negotiated settlement between both sides on the borders. Now Penny Wong is saying this.
So the international community is now considering the question of Palestinian statehood as a way of building momentum towards a two-state solution. Now, there are those who always claim recognition is rewarding an enemy. This is wrong. First, because Israel's own security depends on a two-state solution. There is no long-term security for Israel unless it is recognised by the countries of its region.
Now, Anna, what does this mean and why is the Foreign Minister saying it now?
Well, we are scrutinising that, aren't we? And I think part of this is about dealing with the perception, particularly within the left of Labor, about how this is being handled and the need to speak to communities in, to be kind of brutally political about it in marginal seats who are increasingly upset by what's happening. Penny Wong made those comments on the eve of the Eid Ramadan fast-breaking ceremonies. We went to the Kemba Mosque in Sydney. We were speaking to the leadership there. They specifically didn't invite any politicians to take part in Eid out there this year. They were heartened to hear those words from the Foreign Minister, at the same time as it's been clearly pointed out that while she's raised and floated this prospect, there's no timeline, there's no sort of through way to this becoming a reality. She has said that the international community is talking about this.
Well, just on that, they are. I mean, I had a quick look at this. I mean, Spain has been making it clear for some time that it wants to recognise a Palestinian state. The Prime Minister of Ireland said on Friday the point is coming much closer when they'll do that together with Spain. The Prime Minister of Norway said on Friday, just a couple of days ago, that Norway stands ready to recognise the state of Palestine. So there are some countries that clearly want to do it in a coordinated way.
Absolutely.
To try and drive an outcome here.
And while it might seem like, this is now getting into the territory of what the United Nations Security Council, might veto through the US, then it goes to the General Assembly in terms of that groundswell of, support. We're talking about the vast majority of members of the UN, broader community being in favour of recognition, and so does Australia, the UK and some of these other really important Western allies now go further, pressure Israel through that process.
But I haven't seen, David, from any of them, and nor from the Australian government, how you get to that point where Hamas is removed from the picture.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the international moves are clearly part of the agenda behind why Penny Wong did that. During the course of the week.
And the domestic pressure too.
Yeah, and the domestic pressure. And I also think we should mention the fact that the death of the Australian aid worker, Zomi Frankum, has had an impact in Australia. I think there's clearly frustration in the Australian government. There's shock at how that happened.
It might have it definitely pushed through the willingness of the government, but they've been heading in this direction for some time.
And there's a long history of Labor moving steadily on this a decade ago in, say, recognising Palestine with observer status at the United Nations. That was a huge debate during the Gillard government. So Labor has moved over time. But I do think it's worth pointing out that in Penny Wong's speech, there were three conditions, basically. And in the speech, that seemed to make a case for Palestinian statehood were arguments against it. Hamas cannot be part of it. There must be a reform effort at the Palestinian Authority to come up with a new governance model. And the security of Israel must not be threatened.
You've got to respect the right of Israel to exist.
So those three conditions are incredibly hard to meet. So in the speech, there is an argument for saying, well, Palestinian statehood maybe, but not just yet. And I think Australia has to explore that while these discussions are on at the United Nations.
The comments went down very badly, of course, with pro-Israeli groups and indeed with the opposition here in Australia, which maintains a robust pro-Israeli position. Peter Dutton gave a pretty forceful speech on Wednesday night as well about all of this, really ripped into both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister for, in his view, allowing anti-Semitism to rise since the October attacks. And he, well, this was the most controversial bit. He focused on those pro-Palestinian protests that took place outside the Opera House in Sydney, where anti-Jewish chants were heard, and how the Prime Minister responded to that.
Whilst no one was killed during the protests on October 9, thank God, the events at the Sydney Opera House were akin to a Port Arthur moment in terms of their social and national significance. In my judgment, Prime Minister Albanese has not risen to that moment as John Howard did.
Now, John, he says he was comparing John Howard's reaction to Port Arthur to Anthony Albanese's reaction to this protest, but even making any sort of link there really upset, well, his own Liberal colleague Bridget Archer, the Liberal Premier of Tasmania as well. Was that an overreach?
Yeah, it was probably pretty clumsy and ill-advised to draw parallels with Port Arthur, given 35 people died there roughly, and maybe a better choice of words. But this sort of speaks to the raw politics of what Peter Dutton's all about. He's trying to be very black and white about this situation between Palestine and Israel. He's strongly backing in Israel, obviously, strongly speaking out against anti-Semitism, and he's trying to depict Anthony Albanese as softer on this sort of stuff and more equivocal. Now, Albanese's got a harder task because he's the Prime Minister of the country. He's got to try and unify people. He's got the Greens to his left, who is going very strongly on the pro-Palestinian line as well. So he's got a much more difficult task. It's more a grey zone for Albanese to tread on the left and the right on this issue, whereas Dutton can afford to be a lot more black and white on it.
Yeah, what did you think of that contribution?
I think it was a bit of a shock to a lot of people to hear those words and that particular incident invoked in this circumstance. The opposition leader was speaking at the Opera House. This happened outside the Opera House. I think it was clumsy. I think the point that many within the Liberal Party are trying to sort of explain behind the scenes that was being made was actually about the October 7 attack and Port Arthur, not about the Opera House. But it was deliberate, and it was designed to create headlines, and it was designed to...
Well, it did
but
look
also high
provocative.
risk too, because there's been one survivor of Port Arthur who's talked to The Guardian, but anonymously, so it's an unnamed survivor, criticising Peter Dutton for making those remarks. But he's exposed to more feedback from people who survived Port Arthur, and so it's quite risky to make that kind of comparison in that way, and I think probably ill-advised and therefore counterproductive to his own case.
Yeah, that's certainly true, but on the issue more broadly, it is worth noting there's very strong support from his team for the hardline position that he's taken.
We now end up in a situation where we have a pro-Palestine party in Australia, the Greens, we have a pro-Israel party in the Liberal Party, and Labor trying to hold that middle ground, which on Middle East politics is the worst possible place to be positioned.
Can I just make one quick point? In terms of the polling, the focus grouping that's being done in some of the more marginal seats where this really matters politically for who governs next time around, the view is that there was already a feeling of isolation, of separation for many in the Islamic community that this is built upon. Gaza hasn't created this political problem, is the point.
Yeah, right. All right, our panel, John Kehoe, Anna Henderson and David Crowe, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers, Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with satirist Mark Humphries, and a very warm welcome back.
Wonderful to be back. Hello, Mike.
Mark, on underwater matters, it seems there's a new member of the sub club.
Well, my understanding is that we're collaborating on technology with the Japanese.
Right.
And so my fingers are crossed. Japanese toilets.
Wonderful David Crowe, who's got a touch of the Kevin Costner water world here, I think, and the French submarine.
Mon Dieu!
Oh my God,
That's
as it's passing by, and it's an eel that's eating itself, permission to board.
Now, my understanding is that the Japanese are not going to be supplying us with any submarines. I think the last time the Japanese sent submarines into Sydney Harbour, it did not end well.
I do love the AUKUS Plus, it's very inclusive.
Yeah, that's a new streaming service, isn't it?
Fiona Katauskas, what's not to love? They've got Jawkis here with hugely expensive, logistically questionable, might not even happen.
This terrible pitch to the Japanese. I love that the J is so clearly a last-minute addition.
Yeah.
And also, that could be any government policy.
Yeah,
I think Fiona Katauskas, if you're watching, you could just bring...
You could paint over that.
That's it. Every week, a new cartoon with the same setup. Fantastic.
Badu Chow has got a a little Chinese Pilates going on here.
I think that the Chinese now, they've gotten rid of the wine tariffs, so yeah, they can. I think if they'd been drinking, we wouldn't be in this situation. Just to be clear, though, the government has never explicitly stated which country we're defending ourselves against. Yes. So, I mean, some think it might be China, others think it might be China. I don't know.
Mark, they say a man's got to have a code to live by, and the government says so do supermarkets.
What was wrong with the voluntary code of conduct?
Yeah. We'll police ourselves.
Yeah.
David Rose picked up on this beautifully. Poor old Jim does seem to have some very troublesome wheels here that keep banging into everything. Wibble and wobble as the coolies. And Adam Bance in the baby seat.
That's the worst Adam Bance ever looked, and only David Rowe could do that.
Yeah. Beautiful David Pope. He's done a beautiful lemo here. Craig Emerson. And he drew Jim with these great big wide eyes.
Yes, he looks like a ventriloquist doll there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must be nice when some of the old characters come back. Maybe I've missed it, but I'm waiting for something, Whyalla Wipeout, a Woolies Wipeout. I'm kind of wanting to see if we can bring some of that. Some bit of performance art is what I'm looking for.
Please wait for assistance, please wait for assistance, please wait for assistance. Completely expected item in the hanging area.
They've got such an attitude, those machines.
Yeah.
Try not to let them sense your fear.
Johannes Leek, I can't afford to shop in there, but I do enjoy the window dressing as there seems to be a bit of a performance going on here. Hey presto, everything cheaper. Down.
I keep waiting for them to reform, I think it's the fifth dimension, and just do up and away. That's what it should be now for prices, I think.
It might be a tiny, thin strip of land, but Gaza has repercussions that are spreading across the world. And Brett Lethbridge here may be suggesting that there could be domestic reasons for going hard on this.
Hostages? We're doing this because of hostages. Tony Burke and Chris Bond.
Cedar Watson and Cedar McMahon.
I mean, it's obviously their electorates do have large Muslim communities. I would say, though, I think it was in 2018 at the Labor conference, Penny Wong moved a motion to recognise Palestinian statehood, which was, I think it was seconded by Tony Burke. So they said when there is a Labor government, that's what a Labor government should do, and here we are.
Now, this would be the weirdest thing of the week.
The Register of Interest. So, yes, Labor MP Julian Hill has somehow received this 75-centimetre statue of himself. It's quite large.
Right?
It's quite large, exactly.
That, right?
The interesting thing about this statue, more lifelike than the real Julian Hill. That's what I like about it.
And in a leather outfit, by the look of it, well, which is
well, what he does in his own time is fine. I think there's some symbolism in this, because there's a feather duster underneath.
Yeah.
There's a white package wrapped. And Julian Hill says he doesn't know what these symbols mean. So, if you know, please write in. We'd love to know.
I won't say it's been a great pleasure because it's pretty awful, but I'll let you do the honours.
What an ending. Back to you, and good luck, David Speers.
Thank you very much, Mark Humphries. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations now. John?
A bit of a prediction and reflection. So once the May 14 budget doles out billions more in subsidies for green manufacturing things, I think we're going to see a lot more orange lanyards walking around Parliament House. That's the lobbyists.
These are the lobbyists.
They're going to be trying to suck more money out. And we risk becoming, I think, a country of rent seekers rather than innovators. But the blame for this really should go widely, including on the Coalition and the Greens, because we no longer have a simple, transparent carbon price, which would have dealt with all of this. It was implemented by Gillard, and instead we're going down a much more risky and costly thing that's going to cost taxpayers in so many more hidden ways.
All right, Anna.
The Prime Minister's now expected to walk part of the Kokoda track with the PNG leader James Marape in the coming weeks in the lead up to Anzac Day, and then attend a dawn service in a remote part of PNG. Very significant messaging around diplomacy and defence, but also we'll see what the public makes of a sitting PM taking part of that walk.
We'll see, David.
The Liberals have won the southern Sydney seat of Cook, Scott Morrison's old seat. This is what everybody expected because Labor didn't even pitch a candidate here, but the numbers are interesting. Simon Kennedy, the new member for Cook, won 71.5% of the vote after preferences. That compares to 62.4% that Scott Morrison got at the last general election. So, there's a swing to the Liberals in this unusual circumstance. However, one of the strategists for the Teals, Ed Coper, did some numbers on Cook and found that there was a cohort of Liberal voters who would go to a Teal candidate if they had the choice. They didn't have a choice this time. But I think there's an open question about whether that will happen at the next general election. On these numbers, the Liberals would be very happy. against a potential teal challenger, but you never know.
We will see. Thank you all very much for joining us on a very busy Sunday morning, and thanks for your company too. Finally, when you're doing a radio interview from a dog park, there's always an element of risk. Craig Emerson was taking the normally placid rescue greyhound Arlo out for a play, while talking to the ABC's Ross Solly about his report on the supermarkets. We'll leave you with what followed. Thanks for watching.
If the suppliers are getting just enough to survive, but not enough to invest in new technologies to...
Oh dear, oh dear.
This is our rescue greyhound, and he's not getting on too well with the with the other dogs, and they're fighting back, and it's on here, Ross.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Are you all right there, Dr. Emerson? Do I need to let you go to save a dog's life?
Arlo's he's on the ascendancy.
Oh my God.
He's about 3 times the size
Right.
of the other dog.
Don't take on a rescue greyhound, whatever you do.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.